Well, I would put it a different way. They would like, I believe, nothing more than for the U.S. To become embroiled in a war with Iran. This is, I think, part of the goal. A wider war, we shouldn't think, is something that Israel is trying to avoid. It may well be something that Israel is trying to provoke. This is rather typical of uh, I don't know who the client is. I was going to say a client state manipulating a great power. I'm not sure who really the client is here, but Israel manipulates the United States, and it's happy it's got those aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and now it is hoping, I think, that this could be the chance of Netanyahu's long-held desire that the United States would join a war against Iran. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation on their part. Of course, it would be, again, unimaginably horrific. It could escalate into everything because it could bring in other superpowers, and probably would bring in Russia. Who knows what would happen? And let's be clear, there are lots of fools in the U.S. that also won't mind a wider war. We've got a warmongering group in the Senate, Lindsey Graham types and others, who always want expanded war. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation. We should think of this as a provocation. If it's maybe the ethnic cleansing will work, maybe it will lead to a wider war. Either way, not so bad, says Israel. Of course, their real miscalculation is a different one, and I think it is a very serious one. They're losing the United States. Israel is losing the United States. They don't get that. Just like Biden can't imagine doing anything against Israel, the Israeli leaders think they own the Congress and the U.S. political system, and that is coming to an end, and they do not get that. Just like our Congress doesn't understand our students, Israel certainly doesn't understand what's happening inside the United States right now. And Israel can't go on a day with this without the United States backing it in munitions and backing it diplomatically and geopolitically. So I do think Israel's making a huge miscalculation. I think they're making a cruel calculation to start with, of course, but they're making a huge miscalculation, but not exactly the one that you're pointing to. They're making a miscalculation that they have the United States in their pocket, so they can basically think of the U.S. military as theirs to throw against whatever enemy they want. That is a falsehood. They're going to learn the hard way. I think, in fact, if this continues in this horrific way, the two-state solution really will be gone, and Israel's very survival in the long term will be deeply threatened by the approach that Israel has taken. I see no disaster greater than Netanyahu. He's really, really a piece of work that has done untold damage to Israel in his tenure as prime minister.
And it wouldn't be the first time.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming.
For himself.
Jim, go ahead, please.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming, but it's his life's work preventing a Palestinian state.
Exactly.
And one of the things you brought up, and you may be right about all of this is planned. I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories, but was it all planned in order to lead to another Nakba where Palestinians could be expelled out of Israel? And certainly some cabinet ministers have basically proposed that, saying that Western countries should accept Palestinians in to give them shelter so that they have a future in another place, because they don't want them to have a future. But you tried to talk a little bit before the United Nations about what we need to do to rebuild. The day, even if, let's just suppose that there is a ceasefire coming, and what do we do on day 2 Gaza is all but gone. You talked about getting 10% of the defense budgets of leading countries around the globe to invest in a sustainable reconstruction of Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories. But, how do you get people to go along with that? Because remember, I mean, when they're doing deficit spending, somebody's benefiting, meaning Raytheon, Adomnia, they're benefiting from all of these wars. And if you stop that, if you take away 10% of that, that is a lot of money.
People are going to suffer for years and decades out of what is happening in these days, without question. The loss of life, but the destruction of hundreds of thousands of homes, the dislocation of 2 million people so far. This is devastating, and the destruction in Gaza will have a price tag that under any circumstances the world will not cover. So people will suffer and will be dislocated and impoverished and without any ultimate solution or compensation to this. But what will happen, and it will drive me crazy, by the way, thank God the day the fighting stops, then we'll have a donors conference. And the governments will get together and say, oh, we're going to commit tens of billions of dollars to rebuild what was just destroyed. And it's so stupid that we behave this way, because a lot of my life and career is about trying to raise any funds for impoverished people, getting kids in school, building health clinics. And the idea that you bomb places and then throw the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars at what you just willfully destroyed, but you would never come up with such funding for just helping poor people in the first place is the reality. And remember, it's as we muse about who's going to rebuild Gaza, and the answer is nobody is going to rebuild much of it. The Ukrainians, they actually hold meetings thinking, oh, we're going to have a $750 billion fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Yeah, good luck with that one too. So this is tragedy compounding tragedy. Of course, we have a doctrine in general in economics, an incentive doctrine, which is the polluter pay principle, which is you make the damage, you pay. That's how our courts work also. If it's a trespass or a noxious tort, a public nuisance is the legal term. Israel should pay for this. It destroyed Gaza. It should pay for this. Well, let's try that one. That one's not going to go too well either. But that is that's the principle that should apply, so that a government thinks twice before it destroys another place.
So it's interesting because it moves us. There's a couple of areas I'd like us to cover as we're kind of nearing the end of this great, interview, Jeff. One area is the economics of war and peace, and I'd love to. For you to comment on the juxtaposition that we're seeing now. On the one hand, you've got the utter destruction of Gaza, which is a fairly small place. I mean, Gaza is not this massive World War II kind of Marshall Plan for Western Europe. It's just basically the size, less than the size of Manhattan, I mean, in the grand scheme of things. However, on the other end, you've got a damaged Israeli economy that's basically shedding hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily basis. By an estimate, it's about $12 billion worth of economic, well, that's not opportunity cost, that's direct cost to the war so far in the 60 days. Add to that the opportunity cost for the 300,000 reservists. And
the destruction of the shipping now, which is blocked in the Red Sea, and ships turning away, all of that.
And you're seeing a reduction. Even Israelis are starting to leave, which is fascinating. I was reading somewhere that between 300 and 400,000 Israeli, presumably productive ones that don't want to waste their time on on nonsensical wars, they're going to go to the West and be productive and safe with their families and stuff. So you've got that also going up. And in parallel, and I know you were just in Doha not long ago in the Gulf, and you're seeing this unbelievable wealth creation that is happening in Saudi, where essentially there's been a doubling of productivity just by allowing women to enter into the workforce. And you've got, all that going on in the Gulf, just a complete buildup of that. And if we look at some of the demographics, we're looking at maybe 20 years ago, the Arab world was about 220 million. Now we're about 470 million. And by some projections, the MENA region is going to be 770 million by 2050. And you're seeing this juxtaposition, of these stories. How do you see that playing out, And can really Israel sustainably, from an economic perspective, still sell itself as being this strategic beachhead for the United States at a time when the United States, if it so wanted, has an entire region that's larger than the actual landmass of the United States itself, with potential 770 million people that it can alienate or pacify? I mean, how do you see that in your mind playing out?
Well, I think there are a number of issues here. First, this is very, very costly for Israel, and that's good because maybe it means that Israel will stop what it's doing. Israel cannot afford, ultimately, the greater Israel approach, which is the approach of ethnic cleansing or continued apartheid over the West Bank and Gaza. It doesn't know that yet. It can't sustain U.S. backing for that. It can't sustain the isolation that will come from that. It can't sustain the ongoing fighting that will come from that. So that's one part. More generally, war is, a good business for 5 companies in the military-industrial complex in the United States, but for the world, it's a totally rotten business, of course. Not only does it create tragedy, but it creates mass destruction that is extremely costly to pick up, and the direct outlays on armaments worldwide now is probably $2.5 to $3 trillion. The estimate is about $2.5 trillion, of which the United States is typically measured at $1 trillion, but it's actually much larger than that when you count all of the budget item lines, maybe up to $1.5 trillion a year. So this is all costly, all wasteful. I every day invoke Isaiah, the 8th century prophet whose words are on the wall just across the street of the UN on First Avenue, chapter 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations won't make war on nations, neither will they learn war anymore. He's speaking economically. We should be transforming our armaments into productive activities. This is unbelievable waste, stupidity, and danger, what we're doing. Again, these wars could end essentially immediately, because I also like to quote Karl von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars, who said that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And his point was that war is a kind of politics. So I say, look to the underlying politics. The underlying politics of the war in Gaza is, will there be a Palestinian state or will there be greater Israel? Well, the only answer that can possibly lead to peace is a Palestinian state. And we should cut to the chase and go straight there. As I mentioned, when we look at the war in Ukraine, the underlying politics is the United States trying to push its military to the border of Russia, to surround Russia in the Black Sea, an idea that Zbigniew Brzezinski described in detail in 1997 and that the U.S. has been trying to carry out. It's led to disaster. Again, it's politics. So if we want to stop the war, it's not military that will do it. It's politics that will end these wars, and they could end immediately. We'd save a fortune. The people in the world would be hugely benefited. Of course, those under the bombs first and foremost, but all of us would benefit. Maybe Lockheed or Raytheon shares would go down a little bit. That would be just fine.
Can I ask a question about Lebanon?
Question. Go ahead, Tariq. And there is one question I wanted to get a comment from Jeffrey on.
About Lebanon and the situation in Lebanon and the UN resolution 1701. Now it's back on the table, and Amos 16 is being back and forth to trying to implement borderline and the resolution 1701. Any information on that and the IMF plan for recovery of Lebanon? What do you have for Lebanon? What do you would like to say for the Lebanese audience about these two topics?
I
need another hour.
I wish I could help you on that more specifically, but precisely while that debate has been going on, I was at COP28 and then in Ethiopia, just got back yesterday. So my consultations with diplomats on that start this week.
Would you comment on COP28? What's your take on it? And do you think, as is being reported, it's at least an acceptable move forward? Did it disappoint you in terms of its reach, or were you actually surprised given that it was held in an OPEC, at the end of the day, in an OPEC nation, and something did come out of it at the end?
I was glad that it was held in the Gulf region, and I think the president of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, did a very good job, and the outcome is, as these things go, good. Now, I say as these things go because there's paper and then there's reality. And the paper document that came out is a step forward, definitely. The reality is that the big powers are all directed at these war and peace issues, not at this climate issue. And until we end these wars, we're not going to get the kind of real political capital to decarbonize the world economy, to face up to the financing challenges, and so forth. So I go to COP meetings, all these Conference of the Parties each year, and they're big, interesting jamborees. There were nearly 100,000 people there. A true measure of massive world interest, massive business interest, massive civil society interest, massive scientific interest. But in terms of superpower politics, that's not where the real answers are. And right now, the superpowers are in conflict and in war, and we've got to end that so that they focus on something absolutely real, which is making the planet viable from a climate point of view for the 21st century.
Well, Jeff, I think, I don't know if any of my colleagues has any more questions, but I do have one last question for you. And it's something that I heard you say, which was, obviously I've known you for a long time, but it's still impressive. It's you stated, and I quote, "Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not to believe that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule in every place." And I thought that was a really interesting quote, because you kind of, in many ways, highlight the aspirations of a lot of people who are more on the peace side of things, realizing the sacrifices that might need to be taken. But I'd love for you to comment on this, and whether you look at the next few weeks, months, years in an optimistic tone, or whether having been in development and having been in the throes of geopolitics and the UN for such a long time, whether you've reached a point where you're looking at it more from a pessimistic perspective or an optimistic one.
Let me mention two things. First, immediately in the Israel-Gaza war, those Israelis, and that includes this current government and the cabinet, that believe that Israel has the right, and they would say a God-given right, to rule over the Palestinian people or over the Palestinian territories is the essence of this conflict. And it's unacceptable. And the people of Israel need to live side by side with the Palestinians in peace, and it's perfectly possible to do. But they have to give up their aspiration to rule all of the land. And some Israelis believe that's what the book of Joshua gave them, or some biblical interpretation, and it is has to be put aside. Nobody has that right. Not from God, not from a book of the Bible. People have to live decently, and they have to respect each other. And that's the only way we can survive on this planet. When it comes to the United States, it's even more grandiose. The United States ideology is, and Biden repeated it recently, the U.S. is the indispensable country. It's the country the world looks to for leadership. This is false. It was always false. But in the heyday of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, maybe there was maybe that delusion could be at least a little understood. Is the U.S. really the country the whole world's looking to right now, when it stands alone against the rest of the world? Of course not. The U.S. needs to learn to cooperate. It needs to learn to put aside its own delusion of hegemony. And there are leaders, in fact, it includes this very government, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, who really believe in U.S. hegemony. Well, it's a nonsense. It's a fiction. It's worse than an anachronism, because an anachronism would imply that it was maybe once true. It was never true. And so this is the similar kind of terrible falsehood that needs to be put aside if we're going to get to peace.
Doctor, last word. Is the UN time for reshuffling, time to restructuring, time for new laws for the UN to be more effective, to be able to defend these people? It's time for change in the UN?
Well, I love the UN, first of all, as frustrating as it is, because it is the place where the world meets, and it's the only place where the world meets. And when the world meets, it speaks with a huge voice: peace and justice for Palestine. So it's pretty impressive. Now, it has a voice, but it doesn't have an army. It doesn't have its own tax authority. It is a club of 193 nations. It was founded by nations. It was founded by nations. This is important. It's not global government. It's United Nations. And this is a bit of a problem. I'm in favor of more power, for example, some direct tax power, so that at the global level, we can get some funding for poor people or for emergencies or for other things that we need. Now, next September, there will be a summit of the future at the UN. This is a once in a generation. In fact, it's the first time ever that such a summit has taken place. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the world, think about what we want and what we need for the balance of the 21st century. And we will meet the 22nd and 23rd of September. By then, hopefully, there will actually be some creative agreements reached about the kind of restructuring or strengthening of a new multipolar world and a stronger set of UN institutions that can work for the 21st century. So I'm a believer. I know in history, we've never had global governance. This is only the second attempt in all of world history to have this. The first was the League of Nations. It failed within a generation. The United Nations is 78 years old this year. It is, as I say, I love it, and it's incredibly frustrating. that we can't solve more problems in the way we need to. But we should understand this is a new attempt in human history to have global scale governance. So I don't want us to give up on it. I don't want us to be cynical about it. I want us to fix things so that we can actually make it work.
In Europe, we are seeing that new leaders that are coming to power in Netherlands, in Slovakia. We had Orban. They are against this war in Ukraine, against sending more aids, more weapons to Ukraine. How influential would that be on the U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine?
It's having an effect, obviously. Orban by himself blocked the formal approval of the next round of European assistance. Fico in Slovakia will be joining that cause. The government in the Netherlands is still being negotiated, but the party that came out number one, as you said, Wilders, is against further aid. Of course, the new Polish government probably is pretty gung-ho for more financial and military support to Ukraine. Things are dragging out, but most of Europe does their best to follow blindly the United States. This is really tragic, though all of these cracks in the foundation are clearly appearing. What's stunning is if you look up approval rating of world leaders, and one of the websites that reports weekly opinion polling, there's not a European leader that has a net positive approval rating. Most of them are incredibly unpopular. Scholz, Jonas Gahr Støre in Norway, Macron, hugely unpopular. They're promoting war is not winning public support. There's no one in Europe that has a net positive approval rating in this group of NATO boosters, not even close. And the ratings keep going down and down. Look what's happening to Scholz in Germany. It's a collapse of public support. And in the United States, Biden does not have public support for his foreign policy.
We know that Austria is trying to block the new package of sanctions on Russia. Is that possible that Austria can make some middle ground for both sides?
I think that more and more politicians in Europe are understanding this is wrong. It was a terrible mistake. It's not working. They generally are so beholden to the United States, or for one reason or another afraid of it or bought off, that they don't say in public what they often say in private. But there are more European politicians coming to the fore, definitely saying we've got to stop this, and that will have an effect, not from one day to the next, but it's definitely coming. Similarly, in the United States, public opinion is gone for this. Congress, which listens to the military-industrial complex, is in angst because they want to vote more money for weapons. The Democrats want to support Biden, but it's completely wrong-headed to be sending tens of billions of dollars more without even an attempt at negotiations. So I think that this is a failing policy that will come to an end. It has to, and it doesn't have to, but it's very likely to in 2024. But it's agonizingly slow. And what is so frustrating is the absence of many voices of sanity. Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of them. Fico is a voice of sanity. There are very few right now.
As you mentioned, the U.S. foreign policy is so important. What's happening to the Democratic Party? We know that Cornel West, Jill Stein, even Bobby Kennedy, they're not welcome in the Democratic Party. They have to find their way of fighting in the new election. What the Democratic Party is losing for the next election? How do you see their situation?
Well, I'll give you a personal answer. They lost my vote. I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote Democratic basically all my life, and I have left the party. And I put it in personal terms because I think I reflect a view that is quite widespread. The Democratic Party for me is unrecognizable right now. When I joined the Democrats, I joined originally in the 1960s as I was still in high school, so I was a kid. But the idea was it was at least the part of our political system that was against the Vietnam War. And there was always a strong leftist part of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. And that was what I felt was my home. Now there isn't any anti-war part of the Democratic Party at all. Not in the Congressional Democratic Party, not in the White House. You don't find, other than a very, very few people, any voice for this right now. All the mainstream voices are more war, more funding. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was at school same time I was at Harvard. I've known him for many, many decades. What's his role right now? Well, keep the Senate in session so that we can still send more money to Ukraine. It's terrible. There's no thinking anymore. It's incredibly ignorant. And this is across the Democratic Party. So it's really quite upsetting.
Is the political arena of the United States ready to have a third party, even fourth party? We have Bobby Kennedy, who was not welcome in the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're thinking of, but he has a very good chance of getting more votes from the Democratic Party. We have Cornel West and Jill Stein. Those are so important candidates to make some equilibrium within the Democratic Party.
I think the mainstream Democrats are extremely confused and befuddled, and the wrong message, and they've lost their way. And Biden is a terrible candidate and has been basically a warmonger during this whole period. So it is a position that is outside of American public opinion right now. They've opened the door more for Trump than just about anything else. I sensed it from the beginning that, strangely, because it's a principle of American politics that foreign policy is not decisive, I said, you're going to go down on the foreign policy, which is really something. It was so bad, so misconceived. I wrote a few articles about that this makes no sense, even politically, much less geopolitically, if I could put it that way. It makes no sense in terms of domestic politics. And this is how things are playing out right now. The American public rejects Biden's foreign policy. He is not going to win re-election, most likely, and certainly not on this approach.
And I want you to specifically comment on Cornel West and Jill Stein. Because
they're fine people. They're not going to be president, most likely. They're fine people. Bobby Kennedy has a much larger following and a much larger position in the polls. And we'll see what the dynamics are now. There are, Cornel West is a wonderful person. I've been friendly with him for decades. I don't know Jill Stein personally. But it's Bobby Kennedy that has the name, the public recognition, the position in the opinion polls, and he certainly has an open chance. I urge him all the time: be the candidate of peace. You'll win if you're the candidate of peace. This is really important. This is what the American people want.
Is it possible for him to convince Cornel West or even Jill Stein to be part of his campaign?
Well, I think right now, they're each going to do their thing. They're each going to run. We're still almost a year away from the election. So a lot can happen between now and next November, and we'll see. But for the moment, they're going to campaign. Right now, Bobby Kennedy shows up in the opinion surveys typically between 10 and 20% of support. That's a lot for a third party candidate. And we're early days because most Americans are not really focused on the elections. This is still very much a professional politician thing at this point, and it will only start to heat up at the beginning of next year with primaries and caucuses, and then we'll see how things evolve.
Just before wrapping up this session, I want to know your opinion on this U.S. economic war on China. How is it going with these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel? We know that China is they're doing their way, they're growing. And how do you see right now in the U.S.? Are they focused on the economy? Are they focused on these wars? How these wars going to benefit the economy?
It is pretty much taken for granted among the mainstream of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, I have to say, that China's an enemy. And the rhetoric vis-a-vis China is extremely stupid, low-level, ignorant, and dangerous. And this is both parties, because even parts of the Republican Party that are not interested in the Ukraine war, want to stop the funding, to a significant extent say, yes, because we need the resources to fight China. And so there's a kind of comic book feeling to it that, oh, there could be a war with China. That would just be fine and dandy. Of course, it could end the world. It's so reckless and dangerous, the way that our politicians talk, the way the mainstream media report things, say, yeah, coming war with China, as if that's, a normal kind of statement, as opposed to something absolutely horrifying. And the rhetoric about Taiwan, as if Taiwan is the 51st American state, as if the United States doesn't have a one China diplomatic policy, which they seem to forget. It's all quite dangerous. The U.S., starting with Obama in political ways, starting with Trump in trade policies, and now with Biden in trade policies, finance policies, technology policies, is really leaning hard against China. It's doing some damage to Chinese macroeconomics in the short term, because it's really stopped the growth of China's exports to the U.S. market, and Europe has broadly gone along with this. And so that is hurting a bit, but I think China has ways around that, including expanding its role in the non-U.S., non-EU world. And I expect that to happen. China's underlying strengths for growth are very strong. It's a high saving society with excellent education and very strong research, development, and enterprises that are at the cutting edge of many technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or renewable energy or advanced computation. China has great depth and strength. So this is not a fly-by-night economy. This is a very serious and sophisticated economy with a lot of geopolitical support. And I don't think the United States can, quote, contain China. It's a terrible idea, an absurd idea, a dangerous idea, and I don't think possibly a successful idea. And it's changing very fast from not just a unipolar world with the U.S. Role as a so-called hegemon, but really from a North Atlantic-led world of the last 2 centuries to a world where economy, finance, power is much more spread around the world. The industrial era began in England. It's therefore no real surprise that England or Britain became the first industrial global empire. And Britain ruled the seas and really ruled much of the world during the 19th century. And other European newly industrialized countries formed their own empires in Africa and in Asia. And that Western-led or North Atlantic-led world continued throughout the 20th century. But after two disastrous world wars and a Great Depression, the global leadership of the North Atlantic shifted from Western Europe and Britain to the United States. So the U.S. has been the dominant power since 1945. But with independence of India, the end of empire across Africa, the restoration of real sovereignty of China, starting with the formation of the People's Republic in 1949, and with the economics that has followed that, the world economy has rebalanced. The spread of technology has become far more equal. China, of course, has become one of the lead economies and centers of innovation of the world. India is one of the fastest growing large economies of the world. The world's changing. And for me, a notable point is that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now, when measured at so-called international prices, have larger output than the G7 countries, than the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. So that's a notable change. All of this means we're moving to a multipolar world. None of it means that the United States likes it or accepts it right now. So psychologically, the U.S. is having a very hard time, and it's trying to hold on to its dominance. But that's just not possible in a world of diverse talents, skills, innovation, economy, when the U.S. is just 4% of the world population.
Yeah, I get the feeling that a lot of people, especially in the West, have this idea that they might suffer under a multipolar order. So do you think that fear is warranted, or can the US and the collective West continue to succeed in a more multipolar world?
You know, as an economist, I'm a believer in a win-win world. I don't believe that globalization or the rise of China or the rise of India or the rise of Africa in any way diminishes the opportunities for well-being in the United States or Europe. Indeed, I think it enhances those possibilities. In any event, we need cooperation to face challenges like human-induced climate change. So, for all of those reasons, I believe in a win-win world where gains from trade and advances in economy from technological advances can and should spread around the world. If you are a military strategist or a geopolitical strategist, it seems that the feeling is quite different, that the gain of the other is somehow a loss for you. And so I know that international relations realists sometimes think that China's rise is detrimental to the United States. It's a different mindset. I think it's a dangerous mindset, actually, to think in that way, because it almost inevitably leads to confrontation and the real chance of deadly conflict. And so I want to emphasize the win-win nature of the world economy. It's not one region's gain necessarily at the expense of the other. Everybody can benefit from the advancement of know-how and technology and scientific understanding.
I'm really crossing my fingers. I too am really pushing for a win-win kind of situation. Now, the US and China have gone through obviously a really rough patch in terms of relations of late, with Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan last year, to Balloongate, to these allegations of widespread genocide against the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, to calls for war by 2025, to the Select Committee on so-called competition with the CPC. And of course, lately, we also have TikTok and the mainstream media's kind of feverish obsession with Yellow Peril 2.0, kind of painting China as this dark, dangerous, dirty dystopia. Why is it, do you think, that the US is seemingly so obsessed with tearing China down at the present moment? And what do you think it would take for those relations to improve?
I think almost all of this is the result of China's success. The United States strategists and politicians didn't want a peer or a rival competitor, and then China showed up on the scenes as a large, successful economy that for 40 years plus since 1980 has been one of the most dynamic parts of the world economy, and now at the cutting edge of many leading technologies. And I think the United States political class resents this, is fearful of it. The geostrategists who think in terms of zero-sum struggles think that China's advances to the detriment of the United States. Again, a mindset I don't believe and don't accept, and think is actually a very dangerous one. But most of this is a reaction to China's success. And I think that it needs to be overcome through systematic dialogue, negotiation, hammering out solutions where there are real differences, not the shouting, the finger pointing, the kind of hysteria. Of course, there's a lot of prejudice built in as well. You mentioned Yellow Peril 2.0. Well, there is some feeling wrong in the United States that if China has advanced, they must have cheated to do it. How could they be a competitor with us, after all? This is pretty ingrained and is wrong. I say to these people, get a passport, go take a visit, go learn something, read some history, understand the long sweep of history. I wrote a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, in which China features for hundreds and hundreds of years as the world leading economy, the source of major technological advances. I explain the swings that happened afterwards, but I see China's recovering a natural position as one of the world leaders in innovation and technology. And from my point of view, that's all to the good. But this is not the mindset right now. And I think we have to work hard so that the mindset of fear and zero-sum thinking doesn't overwhelm us and doesn't lead to open conflict, which it could.
Now, speaking of having a passport and getting around, you've been to a few places. You've given economic advice to a number of governments, including those of Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. And in Poland, you were awarded one of that country's highest honors, the Order of Merit, for authorizing a comprehensive plan to switch from a central planned model to the market economy. So I was wondering, based on your vast experience in that area, how you would summarize China's reform and opening up over the past 40-odd years. And do you agree with the idea that this country's witnessed kind of an economic miracle that's without precedent?
China has been the most successful, sustained 40-year economic development and growth of any large economy in history. What's happened in the period since 1980 is extraordinary and extraordinarily positive. China went from being a society with most people living in poverty. The numbers depend on definitions, but 60% poor, some estimate 80% poor, to ending poverty in its extreme form by 2020. Well, that's a phenomenal achievement. And it reflects a mixed economic system, both market and state, private and public, a tremendous capacity to plan at the National Development and Reform Commission, among other institutions, the tremendous capacity to build infrastructure, thousands and thousands of kilometers of fast intercity rail, of roads, of a power system, and so forth, on a massive scale. And the Chinese economy lives on that physical infrastructure that connects the entire country. I've been watching this process closely since my first visit to China 42 years ago. So I came in 1981. China was very poor then. This was very clear just by looking at life as one would see it on the streets or in the shops. I've been visiting China frequently ever since 1981. And what has happened is absolutely extraordinary, hugely beneficial for China and beneficial for the whole world.
So do you think then that China has achieved anything specifically in their poverty alleviation process that maybe other states might be able to emulate?
Well, I say to my friends and governments in Africa that look at what China did over a 40-year period. Africa uses the date, interestingly, of 2063 as its reference point because 2063 will be the 100th anniversary of African unity and the foundation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which is the precursor of the African Union. So they look to 2063. Here we are in 2023. Okay, 40 years. Think of China, 1980 to 2020. Think of Africa, 2023 to 2063. China provides an inspiration and in many important ways, a kind of roadmap. Invest heavily, build infrastructure, get the kids in school, make the quality education, make the real investments that build the capacity of the economy. It's not gimmickry that brought China to its current prosperity. It is heavy investments, large scale, over a long period with good planning, good public administration, and educating generations of Chinese young people in skills, in scientific capacity, and so on. So I think there's a lot that is a roadmap for other regions.
Interesting. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, although kind of related, inflation has been a massive problem recently, but China's inflation rate is currently sitting at 1%, while the US is around 6% and the UK is about 10.4%, I think. In layman's terms, how is it that China is able to keep inflation so low, and do you think that rate will last?
Well, the inflation that is being experienced in the US and Europe is the result of dislocations that came from COVID and from the Ukraine war and from the sanctions that were imposed by the US and Europe in the wake of the war, and from the policy choices that were made in response to these shocks, especially in the year 2020, when the pandemic broke out. The central banks of the United States and Europe issued a lot of credit, a massive expansion of the money supply. And that turned into inflation by 2022. And the disruptions of the global supply chains, first from COVID itself, but then from the war and the geopolitical tensions with China and the sanctions regimes, when combined with the money expansion, boosted the inflation. China didn't do the same thing. China didn't make this massive monetary expansion in 2020 the way the Federal Reserve did. And China is not experiencing the same disruptions that came from the sanctions regimes, which have in some sense boomeranged on the sanctioning countries because it's disrupted their own supply chains. So I think this is partly the result of shocks and partly the result of policy choices and I'd say some policy mistakes that were made in the West. There's no reason why this phenomenon has to be a global phenomenon in the same way.
Now, I kind of want to flip about 180 degrees. What do you think happened with Nord Stream?
Well, Nord Stream was a project that the United States opposed from its inception. Nord Stream is the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe, and the United States said from the very start that Europe should not buy gas from Russia. I disagree with that analysis, but the U.S. said, well, that will make Europe dependent on Russia. To my mind, it's not a matter of dependency, it's a matter of economics and trade. Russia has a lot of inexpensive gas. Europe has a great manufacturing capacity. Buying that gas is good for Europe's competitiveness and for production. And that's where the pipeline idea came from. But the U.S. hated the pipeline. The U.S. said, well, this makes Europe follow Russia's geopolitics and so forth. I think that this was not the right approach. But it all leads me to believe that the most likely scenario of Nord Stream is the U.S. blew it up because the U.S. hated the project. The U.S. warned that in the event of a Russian invasion, the pipeline would end. President Biden himself said that on tape on February 7th, 2022. And when the reporter asked, but Mr. President, that's an international project. How can you say it will end? He said, believe me, we have our ways. Well, I think we probably saw those ways with the destruction of the pipeline. It's not proved. The story that the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put out is very credible, and it has not been knocked down in any substantive way. And I had the opportunity to speak to the members of the UN Security Council and strongly urged an independent UN-led investigation. Let's get to the bottom of it. Countries know more than they're telling. We need to investigate. Well, China and Russia and Brazil said, yes, let's investigate. The United States said, no. Well, why do you say no? We need to find out. So I continue to urge the UN to investigate this because we need security of international infrastructure. And when a major pipeline is blown up, it's actually a global threat to the peace.
What do you think are the chances of the UN undertaking an investigation?
Well, I hope more and more countries support the idea of an independent investigation because there are many facts that need to be known, and because if we're going to succeed in fighting climate change, for example, we're going to need a lot of international infrastructure. We want it to be secure. We don't want it to be blown up. So when there is a major piece of infrastructure blown up, I say it's a threat to the peace in the sense that we need fiber, we need pipelines, we need power grids in submarine cables to make our world economy function properly. So we need security of the international infrastructure.
Do you think TikTok will be blocked in the US?
We're in a kind of mode of hysteria and panic and anti-China everything. So everything's possible. It's really, really discouraging to see our Congress waste time on this. And the anti-China feeling, has tried to destroy a lot of Chinese companies in recent years. Huawei, another one that was hard hit, but is finding its way around the U.S. Sanctions regime. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that Congress calms down. I hope that all of the U.S. geopolitics directed at China calms down. We need dialogue, discussion, negotiation. We don't need a ban on TikTok.
Okay, last question for today. Is the US a dying empire, and is all the provocation and calls for war and smearing and so on evidence of the last, I don't know, desperate throes of US hegemony? And if so, how can we keep safe and avoid nuclear war?
Well, look, the US is not and cannot be the global hegemon, meaning it can't be the country that runs the world. The US is 4% of the world. There's a lot of talent, creativity, and desire for sovereignty and for a say in world affairs all over the world. So the US is not the world hegemon, but it needs at the political level to get its head around that reality. To have a foreign policy not based on supply side shock and a demand side shock. The supply side is, as you say, a massive diversion of resources from the civilian economy, from day-to-day life and day-to-day work to the military. That's a big deal. And at the same time, this war is very expensive. All wars are very expensive. And I heard a number which I can't verify of $100 million a day. I don't know whether that's right, but it's a lot, and it's a big burden from the budgetary point of view. And Israel will pay a heavy price for that. And of course, the U.S. Is proposing, or the Biden administration's proposing, to pick up a lot of that tab as well. And we're not exactly in a healthy fiscal situation. We have an enormous deficit, which reflects in no small part the extraordinary military spending of our country. So all in all, wars are bad for the economy, bad for the budget. If people think war is good because it boosts the spending and so forth, yeah, maybe if you are Northrop Grumman or Boeing or General Dynamics, okay, I can imagine it's not bad for you. But if you're the rest of us, this is no help at all. We have other things to do with our time, our money, our resources, our budget revenues, and we should be doing other things with them.
Now, the U.S. has not started to send, because I don't think the Congress authorized it yet, any funds or equipment to Israel from and after October 7th, other than the aid that had been pre-authorized, which was before the attack on October 7th. But whatever we send now, we'll have to borrow, probably from the Chinese. It's almost absurd. We're going to borrow from the Chinese and give to the Israelis, and then we're going to print cash to pay the interest on the borrowed money.
I think everybody understands that our public debt has soared to more than 100% of our national income. And on top of that rising mass of debt is the sharply higher interest rates. So suddenly the interest payments on the debt are not a footnote, but have become a very, very major part of our budget outlays. And when the Congressional Budget Office projects forward based on our current policies and extends them out in future years, the debt to GDP, that is the share of the ratio of our public debt to our national income, continues to rise sharply in the decades ahead to reach 180 or 190% of our national income by the middle of the century. So, we don't pay our bills, but we say, don't worry, we'll pay other people's bills too. Not a good idea.
I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I got to ask you another question. How long could the United States survive with a debt to GDP ratio like that?
Well, we can survive, but it is very unhealthy, because the interest payments will start swamping other things that we absolutely need to do in our society to have a decent society. It squeezes out everything else. And so I'm sorry to break some heavy news to people, but even though no political party will touch this, and I don't know for how many years to come, we're going to actually need higher taxes in this country. And that's not my speaking as a lefty or liberal. It's looking at the budget. And so this is real. For a long time, both parties completely pretended that it's not real. Both parties. The Republicans pretended you make a tax cut and we gain more in output so we don't even lose revenues. Okay, wonderful story. And for the next fairy tale, we'll go someplace else. The Democrats basically took a different line. The debt doesn't really matter. We owe it to ourselves. Interest rates are low as far as the eye can see. Another fairy tale. And so both parties have done this. But from 2000 till today, the debt in 2000 was about 35% of our national income. Now it's around 100% of our national income. You could debate a little higher, a little lower, depending on what's covered. That's striking. That's startling. That's the responsibility, or better said, the irresponsibility of both parties. That is war after war that has been funded out of borrowing. And now we want to fund other people's wars too. It's extraordinary.
Correct. Are you satisfied that the plan of Prime Minister Netanyahu is to eradicate Gaza and the West Bank of all Palestinians?
We don't know about the West Bank yet, but the result of the policies right now is absolutely ethnic cleansing in Gaza. They say, no, don't. Even, longtime colleagues and friends of mine in Israel, how dare you use that expression? Well, if you destroy half the housing in northern Ghana, you've cleansed the region. If you have pushed hundreds of thousands of people south and then announce, as they're doing right now, we're moving into South Gaza, what else can you call it? This is not a hunt for Hamas. This is destroying Gaza. And we know that there are people in the Netanyahu cabinet who are vulgar and explicit on these points. And it's unbelievable incitement. It is war crimes as far as I'm concerned. And I think legal specialists are going to be finding that. It's horrific. And it's ongoing.
I don't know if you know of or have ever met this retired Israeli Major General Giora Eland, E-I-L-A-N-D. Major General Eland is the former head of the National Security Council and current advisor to the defense minister and to the prime minister, who sees no difference between the Hamas fighters and the civilian population. And that's the advice that he's giving on a daily basis to the defense minister. He's come just one word short of the phrase ethnic cleansing or the word genocide. Quite frankly, I'd never heard of him until one of our colleagues sent me a piece which quotes a speech that he gave just the other day. And the finance guy, Smotrich, I think I have his name right.
That's right.
Tweeted out the speech and put it out on all of his social media. He liked it so much. This is dangerous stuff, Jeff.
Well, it's extraordinarily dangerous. It's criminal behavior, and I don't mean that in an emotional sense. I mean that in a literal sense. And the Centers for Constitutional Studies, one of the think tanks in our country on constitutional studies, say that there's growing evidence of genocide. And under the Genocide Convention, genocidal intent is part of the crime of genocide. You have to show intent. And these Israeli leaders are leaving a trail of intent, which is absolutely shocking. And this Centers for Constitutional Study has said that the United States, by providing armaments and standing along with Israel, is complicit in this possible genocide. Now, I want to be careful that these are potential legal claims, but I think that they have potential significant merit. And all of this over the top or under the bottom rhetoric of these Israelis is setting a record that is stark for referrals to the International Criminal Court and for the Court of Global Opinion. I was at the UN. I'm at the UN frequently, but in the UN General Assembly, at the UN Security Council, people are watching and they're hearing this and they're completely shocked by it.
I want to run two clips. First, Admiral Kirby yesterday on genocide. This is about as animated as I've seen him. Apparently someone, I don't know how you can do this, spray painted on one of the walls of the White House. I don't know how a human being can get to a wall of the White House that wants to spray paint it, and they spray painted. Well, I don't even remember during the Vietnam War anybody spray painting anything negative about LBJ in the White House. Anyway, somebody spray painted Genocide Joe.
Someone on the staff?
No. Well, they don't know
Okay.
who it was.
We won't go there.
No, God. Well, apparently there's a lot on the staff that are of that view. Nevertheless,
Yes.
Somebody spray painted that. Here's Admiral Kirby, about as animated as I've ever seen him on genocide.
I said this the other day. Again, people can say what they want on the sidewalk, and that we respect that. That's what the First Amendment's about. But this word genocide is getting thrown around in a pretty inappropriate way by lots of different folks. What Hamas wants, make no mistake about it, is genocide. They want to wipe Israel off the map. They've said so publicly, more than one occasion. In fact, just recently. And they've said that they're not going to stop. What happened on the 7th of October is going to happen again and again and again. And what happened on the 7th of October? Murder, slaughter of innocent people in their homes or at a music festival. That's genocidal intentions. Yes, there are too many civilian casualties in Gaza. Yes, the numbers are too high. Yes, too many families are grieving. And yes, we continue to urge the Israelis to be as careful and cautious as possible. That's not going to stop, from the president right on down. But Israel is not trying to wipe the Palestinian people off the map. Israel's not trying to wipe Gaza off the map. Israel's trying to defend itself against a genocidal terrorist threat. So when we're going to start, if we're going to start using that word, fine, let's use it appropriately.
I'm convinced that he's incorrect, that Israel does want to wipe Gaza off the map, that it does want to remove the Palestinian people from what Israel claims is greater Israel, whether they're civilians, women, children, poor, young, old, or not?
You know, when we use an expression like, what does Israel want to do? Of course, what we mean is, what do particular politicians and particular leaders want to do?
We mean the Netanyahu government.
We mean specifically the cabinet or
that's in there,
the Israeli Defense Forces or others.
Right.
And there is a growing body of statements that are really ugly. And they have been compiled, as I said, by the Center for Constitutional Studies. And that center made a lawsuit. I don't know whether it was thrown out or not. I haven't followed the events, but they made a lawsuit in California claiming that the United States was guilty of complicity in war crimes and potential genocide. And in providing, making that lawsuit, they provided dozens of pages of evidence that people should look at, including Mr. Kirby, to start with, because Mr. Kirby's throwing around slogans and narrative, but he should look at what's actually being said by people that he's defending. And what is being said is absolutely ugly and disgusting, and not just words. The fact of the matter is, Israel is, and when I say Israel, okay, I mean the Israeli army and government is in the process of killing thousands and thousands of people and thousands of children, and they know they're doing this and destroying the habitability of Gaza. And some have said, and I can only paraphrase, but the words matter, so we have to know the precise words, which I don't have in front of me, to the effect that Gaza won't be habitable again. I think I'm fairly paraphrasing at least some of these politicians. But the point is, there is a growing record. It's not going to be up to Mr. Kirby making a claim. There's going to be a full record of the statements, and the Israeli politicians are not being prudent. They are not being restrained. There is no forbearance. Many of them are absolutely speaking in the worst, most intemperate, insightful, and hateful ways. And it's completely distressing. But more than that, it is establishing a record that they will really regret of having said it this way.
You recently gave a compelling and articulate statement to the United Nations. I didn't know that private citizens, I realize the high regard that world diplomats have for you, but I didn't know that private citizens got to address the United Nations. But you did, and I read it, and many of us read it. But isn't the United Nations effectively toothless to stop this when the United States is going to veto anything that comes out of the Security Council that purports to admonish Israel?
What I said with this great honor of addressing the UN Security Council is that the UN Security Council, under the UN Charter, has all the teeth it needs to bite into these wars and actually end them, because it has the power to deploy armies, peacekeepers, sanctions, to make referrals to the International Criminal Court, and to do many other things, because in the wisdom of the founders of the United Nations in 1945, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the UN Security Council is empowered to keep the peace. So what I called on them to do is, especially for the P5 countries, those with the veto, that's the United States, China, Russia, UK, and France, to work together to end these wars, because these wars are not in America's interest, nor in the interests of any one of the P5 countries. And if they work together, rather than grandstanding or vetoing, they have all the tools they need to end 4 wars that I talked about yesterday: the Israel-Gaza war, the Ukraine war, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa. All of them could be stopped immediately by the cooperation of the United States, China, Russia, UK, and France. And people say, oh, it's impossible to get cooperation. But the fact of the matter is, it's the United States which is standing alone in evading responsibility. And it's the United States. So weird. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's not anyone else.
Was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations there when you spoke, Professor Sachs?
She was right across from me. I was staring her in the eye. She was staring me in the eye. I haven't had a chance to talk to her since then, but absolutely, she was right across the table. And I hope that she heard, because what I was saying was not a wish list of wouldn't the world be nice if. I was pointing out for 4 wars how to end them now in that chamber, because wars can be ended by diplomacy, not only on the battlefield. But for diplomacy, you have to accept a diplomatic outcome. And that's, for example, Israel doesn't want to accept a diplomatic outcome of what every UN Security Council resolution has called for, which is political rights for the Palestinian people. So it bombs, levels Gaza, kills thousands or possibly tens of thousands of people before this is over because it doesn't want a diplomatic outcome. But what about the United States? The U.S. professes to want a diplomatic outcome.
Right.
President Biden said at the end of this is a two-state solution. So I said very practically, and it is practical, it's not some kind of dream, declare a state of Palestine now. The UN Security Council has the tools to do this, but the United States blocks the use of those tools. So instead of President Biden saying, oh, it's at the end of this, after how many thousands of children are killed, he could say it today and stop the killing. So get on with it already.
Let's just talk big picture for a minute, because your life's work has been in this. What is the value of international law if there is no mechanism for enforcement of it?
Again, international law is our saving grace. And we have the mechanisms to use it. We can deploy sanctions, we can deploy peacekeepers, we can do many powerful things. But if the United States blocks it, then it doesn't work. So this is up to us to use international law effectively. The laws on the books right now, those are UN Security Council resolutions, have everything in them to make peace. It's all a matter of enforcement. And the point I was making yesterday is the United States is blocking enforcement. Now, why do we do that? We do that because we think we're so powerful, we're so mighty, that we don't have to use international law. We just get our way. What way exactly are we getting right now? Trillions of dollars of wasted money on wars, hundreds of thousands or millions of people dying if you add across these wars uselessly, endangering United States security around the world. What exactly are we getting by not sitting down with China, Russia, UK, and France to settle these wars? We're not getting anything out of this. That's the plain fact. And that's, I think the American people are understanding this more and more. They're, interestingly, in the opinion polling, President Biden shows up at the bottom on foreign policy. People don't believe that there's any